Good evening, everyone. Just a few safety issues, quite important to just understand where the exits are. You only one. So we get it first. Yeah. And if you those of you that need to use the toilets down the passage here. We have allowed for if there's an overrun of people for a live streaming next door at our office. So for those who are going to be hosted at our office, you can use our boardroom bathroom. Okay, so welcome everyone. Jakupa's E1T1 program started in 2012. The idea of the program really was fueled by our frustration of not getting commissions, the stuff that we're interested in. Housing being one of them, a sector that is quite close to our hearts, and we are keen interest in. So the idea really, the program had come to it. The COVID, and we felt it quite important that we spark debate in our industry around important issues around, particularly housing. And we felt that this year being 2024, it's quite a significant year. It's a significant year for us because 2005 we started this practice. 1st of February 2005. The next year we celebrate 20 years in practice. And we thought it important as a build up to our 20th anniversary that we encourage debate like this. And that is the first of our program as a build up to our 20th anniversary. The intention of this E1T1 event is to get, like I said, spark debate among people and contribute to the growth of the sector, a very important sector like housing. The event is sponsored by ETEC, Voltec, and Protec. Pontec. The event is co-hosted by the Cape Institute for Architecture. I think with that, I'm going to call our president, Michael Boxer, to do a short introduction.
Welcome everyone tonight. My name is Michael. It's great to partner with Jakupa. We have been attempting to make CPD, continuing professional development, more interesting. And this year we've certainly had a lot of luck with the open architecture events and naturally feeding into this. So it's a great idea. It feeds on our idea that the Institute for Architecture is supposed to be our spiritual home for architecture. However, it hasn't been an easy place to have open discussion. And that's why things like tonight are kind of key building blocks to putting this back together. Equally, there are certain things that I think have been kind of lost along the way, and it's the idea of mentorship. So it's great to see so many young people here tonight. I can remember I would never have known about the Institute for Architecture if I hadn't been taken there by one of the partners at one of my first practices that I worked for. So it's great to see this idea of mentorship, being able to openly talk and discuss architecture. We having quite a rough year down at the Institute, so you would have seen many notices coming past. We've had to scale down. We used to have 3 floors of the building, we're now down to 1. This event would have been down at the Institute in the gallery, but unfortunately there are too many people, so it's a much better space, this. And I think the thing that we just want to try and bring back to the community of architects is that we have an open door, And if you too would like to host events like this, feel free to speak to myself and Asa at CIFA. So without too much talking from my side, I want to hand over to Edgar Pitzer, who's going to be the first talker tonight. And ideally, we want this to be an event where we can freely talk. So there's going to be a time for discussion afterwards. So don't feel shy. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty about some of these topics that we're going to be talking about. Cool. That's that.
Okay, that must be my magnetism. Thanks, Andy. So firstly, my name is Edgar Pitzer. I'm the director of the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And I've got more recently another title, which I never have an opportunity to throw around, but I will in this context, because I don't often get to socialize with architects. So, so since last year, I've been appointed as the provost for the Norman Foster Institute. I mentioned that because applications for the next cohort is open, and it is an incredible program, and because there are, as you said, so many young people, you know, like put your hat in the ring. Spend some time with this year's code, the inaugural code, in January, and yeah, it's like just intellectual. It's like an intellectual spa. You've got the best scholars from around the world, the best tech, the best data analytics, blah, 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 blah. And of course, Madrid is a fabulous city. So you get to spend a year with amazing people that will lead the field, no doubt, in the next generation, and so on. So that's a little plug for that. But on to tonight, and wow, how cool is this? Very, very nice. Thanks, guys. Jakupa, amazing. And also, what a thoughtful and absolutely profound way to celebrate your 20th anniversary that is upcoming. And for me in particular, having been around the block a few times, there's very few black firms in this space. And to see one that is not just thriving and growing and doing amazing work, but that also invites critical discourse and debate between the academy, the private sector, and the city at large. So that's what I have to do. So I've been asked to do two things tonight, if I can get my iPad to it. One is to speak for about 8 to 10 minutes to frame the conversation. And then to introduce our two speakers for this evening that will share some more pointed ideas and more concrete things. Since I don't know how to actually build anything, you know, we've got people who understand the actual real world that will share with us, and then to moderate a bit of a discussion amongst ourselves and the two speakers. We've got timelines in mind, but I think we're also going to be quite fluid. And so feel free to be as engaging and as participatory as you want to be. So let me kick off. So our theme for tonight, to just remind you, in case you haven't reread your invitation, the objective of the discussion is to unlock our understanding of housing delivery for those who are not recipients of a housing subsidy and is not catered for by the market. So that happens to be almost the majority of urban residents in a place like Cape Town, for reasons that I will try and set out very briefly. So before we get into this specific problem space that we will engage with this evening, it is important to step back a little bit. 30 years of democracy, 30 years of urban housing policy, got an election coming up in a few weeks' time. And before that election, the Minister of Human Settlements is determined to release the second draft of the Human Settlements White Paper. And the process since it was unveiled in January up until now is quite telling about what I would call the schizophrenic nature of the policy environment around human settlements. So at the heart of the pathology is a very strange and bizarre story. In 2004, Breaking New Ground was published. It was quite remarkable. In government terms, it was brief, it was relatively short, which was kind of unknown in the urban and human settlement space. But most importantly, it was as if government was coming into maturity. It was able to speak back to itself and be sort of brutally honest that the housing system and the housing framework and delivery model was a failure, that it was exacerbating the problem of spatial inequality, and it was in fact putting the urban poor and poor people in South Africa more generally, it was putting them in an economically more disadvantaged position because they were meant to inherit an asset. One, they often didn't have the title to it, and secondly, it depreciated immediately as soon as they received transfer. And if you then look at the quantum of investment that was made, this was, any way you sliced it, a disaster story. Now, for a government to be that brutally honest with itself, that's an interesting story in of itself. What's the sort of ethnography of how that policy came to be, et cetera, not the topic for tonight. What is the topic for tonight is the fact that that moment set up almost a bipolar condition for the state. On the one hand, there was now this incredibly compelling vision that required the production of a new authorizing and regulatory environment, in other words, new legislation and new policy frameworks to give effect to the intent of BNG. And since 2004, and now, when the white paper was published in January in 2024, it's the first time that the national government was able to get its shit together and produce a white paper. In 20 years. What an indictment, right? Not just on the state, but on all of us, because we are all, in a democratic context, complicit and party to this failure. It's all of us. So I'm not pointing fingers, but I'm reminding us that this is an indictment of the urban practice, urban thought community, and of course, the people who bear the brunt of it are citizens. Now, what happened in that lacuna is the state just plutoed forth, right? They just did what they had to do to process the subsidy regime, because political capital depended on whether the Auditor General said you are spending or underspending on your housing subsidies. So what the machine does is the only thing it knows how to do, which is to try and process that subsidy system, even though it knows in its own terms through BNG that it is producing the wrong kind of settlement outcomes, and it is fundamentally undermining its own citizens through that act. So that is schizophrenia, that you continue to behave in a way that is completely antithetical to the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And we, of course, are all part of that process. Now, fast forward to 2024, white paper published, the NGO community mobilized very quickly, wrote a letter to the minister and said, Minister, we are super grateful that you finally got your act together, that we have something to talk to, but this is not worth the paper it is written on. Please, please, please put it in the shredding machine and start afresh. Of course, there's an election at the end of this month. There was no way that that was politically an option for the minister. So the compromise has been that they are crowdsourcing the updating and the refinement of the draft white paper so that it can go to cabinet before it dissolves by the end of the month. So there's been a fascinating process of different academics, NGOs, social movements engaging with public policy officials over the last month, literally writing the updated 2.0 version of that white paper as we speak. We don't know what is going to be the outcome of it, but it is telling that that is the state of play in the macro policy environment. Now, the sort of third point that I want to make is that what the schizophrenia has produced is what I would call a normalization of dysfunction, right? Because that's the only thing the system can do. And so everyone in the private sector, in communities, you adapt to that de facto condition. And of course, in a sense, reproduce it, right? But the problem with that is that it sets up a misallocation of capital. Because the problem is that when you invest the subsidy regime in the way that you do, you're building the wrong kind of fabric, you're building in the wrong place, you're generating local economies around the wrong things, is that then there's a vested interest to reproduce that system. Right? So it is not just that you're reproducing the framework, but you are reproducing an economic logic that is very difficult to dislodge. So there's vested interest. So the final point around this white paper question that I want to suggest is important for our conversation this evening is that if we accept that this is a moment of reflection, that there is a political and a policy opening, what should drive the way we think about human settlements? And I want to suggest that that part of our challenge that we face is that the scale of the problem is much greater now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Let me read you a statistic from the Western Cape government about the Western Cape. This was published in the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook of 2023. And they say, this is according to government data, between 2014 and 2023, the total registered housing demand in the Western Cape increased by 267,117, or 76%, reaching, and this is the golden number, 618,765. That's the housing demand. Now, it goes on to say that in the fiscal year of 2021 and 2022, the Western Cape government delivered 6,191 houses and just under 4,000 service sites and service sites. Right? 600,000, 6,000. So we're scratching the surface at about 1% of the need in the current framework. Now, we obviously never get ahead of the problem in that fiscal and policy environment. So a big part of tonight is to then pay attention to the bit that doesn't happen because the subsidy quantum is insufficient and the delivery system is inappropriate. What do people do in that context? And we've got amazing practices that have been really reflecting on this specific question. And we want to use this tonight to suggest that the paradigm shift we need is maybe not to be so fixated on the formal policy framework and the subsidy regimes and systems, but to see whether we can build an innovation framework that is much more organic and from the ground up. So what are the practices of households and families and neighborhoods that are responding to human settlement needs despite the state? And can we decode those practices and if you will, a kind of intelligence and maybe apply our built environment professional skills to codify that in some way to both generate an understanding of how do we build sustainable human settlements in an imperfect world. Secondly, what are the kind of business models we're really talking about here? And by business model, I don't mean it as a swear word. I mean it as a lifeblood of a local economy. Because for me, at least, we've got to appreciate that in 2024, in the global moment that we look, there's three drivers that has to inform any discussion about a systemic solution. The first driver is to recognize that poor households, we need to address in the first instance their livelihood imperative. Everything else is second. People need to have the dignity of work and have the resources to live and feed themselves. Secondly, we've got to appreciate that 2.5 degree warming is now a fact. We are way past the hope of staying below 2 degrees in terms of global warming. The impact in this part of the world and in Africa will be at least double that. And so we simply cannot but incorporate a climate resilient and a biodiversity frame into our design. It's not a nice to have, it's not a cool thing to do. It is a fundamental prerequisite for resilience. It's just what it is. And the third issue is probably the most important dimension, which is designing for safety. The degree of low intensity and overt violence that have become normalized in the dysfunctional human settlements we're talking about is simply beyond any comprehension. And so from a design and a business development perspective, how we rethink this framework in terms of livelihood, resilience, and safety and security, especially for women and children, are the fundamental anchor points of what this imaginary needs to be. And so how do we learn from everyday practice? Firstly, and we'll get into that tonight, we've got to be much more explicit about differentiation. So the typology between freestanding, informal, the backyard context, the residential township context, the suburban context, and of course the wealthy parts of the city like this, all of that was fair game for thinking the problematic of inclusionary housing and much more vibrant and economically resilient settlement. But where do we begin? We begin by paying attention to what people are doing themselves. Absolutely. Secondly, we try and be in constant dialogue with contexts and places and practices that have kind of faced similar kinds of challenges, but have figured out how to build systems of learning and adaptation and experimentation. And I can't really think at the moment, sort of from the Cape Town ecology, of two better practices who can share some of their work in this regard. So firstly, we will have Heinrich Hof this evening, who will share some of their experimental work, I would say, some of their research, some of their insistence that there is an intelligence, there's a logic, and there's an elegance to how people cope with scarcity. And I don't want to steal Heinrich's thunder, but he will sort of speak more to that. And Heinrich, of course, you all know him better than sort of other constituents. He's won many awards on the visiting faculty of Harvard University. He's previously associated with ETH Zurich, with University in Venice, I think, is that right? Yeah. And I'm ashamed to say, used to be with UCT, but no longer. So we better fix that. And of course, his partner in crime, Ilse, is also with us. And welcome, Ilse, was just returned from teaching her class in New York. And then Khalid Jacobs from Jakupa will share after Heinrich. And they've also, we go back some time. I had a little, anyway. But they've been really sort of at the cutting edge of thinking within the constraints of the different subsidy streams and instruments, and realizing projects with the Western Cape government, with the City of Cape Town and other municipalities, and the private sector. How does one advance this agenda of inclusionary housing? What does that look like? And I think there's many examples to their practice. But one of the issues that I'm very surprised is so under-reflected and represented is the fact that we finally have a substantial mixed-use, mixed-income intervention sort of adjacent to my neighborhood in Pinelands, which is the Conradi Park area, which is, pushing boundaries in all kinds of ways. And it just always surprises me the sort of learning from that and the sort of models and so on that isn't, sufficiently aired and translated and helping the larger community be much more ambitious about what's possible. And the connecting point between the two of them is that work prefigures what is possible in Cape Town's abundant publicly owned land, particularly golf courses, and Heinrich will share some useful and fantastic provocations on that. And I just want to leave you with this. that it is all of our collective responsibility to accept therapy. We're all part of the schizophrenic condition that we live in. We all have to play a role in, if you will, defamiliarizing that so that we can see ourselves strange and we can understand we are sick and that we need a path of healing. These conversations is restorative in that sense. It helps us to remind ourselves that we can get better, we can do better, and we can achieve a lot more. So I'm grateful for the two speakers, and I want to first give over to Heinrich to share with us his thoughts.
So just hearing, am I hearing music?
Very our latest.
It's closing. Do I really need this microphone?
Yeah, for the camera.
For the recorder, usually. Okay. So in theory, this should work. Yeah, I think it's fine up there.
Your emails.
Just your presentation.
There we go. Thank you very much. I just want to say, I think, like Edgar was saying, this is an absolutely fantastic moment. He always says she likes nerds a lot. And, you know, to celebrate 20 years of practice, the greatest party we can think of is talking about housing. Our kind of people. Thank you very much. We are super stoked here and celebrating 20 years of colleagues' practice, and particularly the two of you. I also won't tell them where we met, but it's, I think it was 1993, but I'm not mistaken, but it goes back a long while. So just to get straight into it and to stick within the time constraints, in very basic language, I was trying to think of 3 ways that you can get a house if you don't qualify. So the first one is you build it yourself. And this is thinking, reflecting on research that we've been doing in Dunoon over about a decade, that takes existing infrastructure, namely legal infrastructure, properties, roads, services, etc., and speculating with it. So what we have is one of the legacies of subsidized housing over decades in South Africa, is that you have South Africans being turned into property speculators. Of course, the one thing that you have is a house that's small, a property that's a bit bigger, and there's extra land. And as a way of making a livelihood, you speculate with the land, you rent out property, and you make do by doing that. That has taken all the recipients of subsidized housing and almost made them entirely into land speculators. So in Dunoon, we studied all the houses and what they get changed in, and one day we decided to do the opposite, to try and find a house in its original condition. All the subsidized houses, we found one that was after a decade that wasn't, where a family was living in their house without speculating with the land. It means everyone does it. So in Dunoon, typically between 4 and 6 additional houses, the maximum we found was 22 on one property. Okay, so what we're interested in is the will of the people. There's an idea of Denise got around people voting with their feet, but there's something about people just doing what they're doing, and as opposed to making proposals as architects, we simply want to learn what are the patterns of urbanization, regardless of our opinions, what are people doing? So we studied all sorts of aspects in Dunoon. Today I'm just going to talk about these rental apartments. So what you have here is you have the subsidized house there in pink on the right, and then the backyard shacks. I think many of you are familiar with it. But the logic of constructing a brick building, as you see there in white, or a backyard shack, it is a piece of land that's turned into accommodation, it's rented. You would find in the noon people might move out of their subsidized house into the shack, rent out the house because it's more money, or the other way around where you rent it out. And then you find these kinds of buildings that I first saw when we did the crazy school day in 2006. We saw these things happening, and like, what was it? We launched a research project. In short, the rentals per square meter in Dunoon is equivalent to Bantu Camps Bay, really single story accommodation. So the economics there and the level of amenity is not bad at all. A lot of people, when I've given this in public, people would say, I lived in a place like that as a student. Not necessarily looking like that on the outside, but if you see the room on the inside, it's that size, that level of amenity, sharing bathrooms. It's not uncommon for many of us sitting in this room of all sorts of backgrounds. That's at a certain age what you can afford. But what are we looking at here? We are looking at a property where somebody who was running a vegetable store incrementally develop housing. That is a fundamental feature of this. So if you build houses like this, you do it incrementally. Nobody does it in one big bang ever. They're selling vegetables, they're getting a bit of money, they're adding to it. So they first built the ground floor, then they built the upper floor, but then they built this portico in front. So there's this thing of expanding and expanding, and when you get to the edges, what we sometimes find is that people then move a bit over the edges. That became interesting for us, because the question is what are the limits? So for instance, in Dunoon, you have the curb, and then there's a tarred sidewalk, but the property boundary is actually there. But that's imaginary. But that's in the mind of the surveyor general. So, he's very happy not to have made the survey. So that line is real, and you build to the real line, and not to the imaginary line. Why would you? But it is known. So if you look at it, you can see there on the right, the building was built, and then they leaped over the property boundary. So it is known, but it's sort of seen as useless. So we built there. And then what was built? So one is a strip that enlarges the store, that is the economic part that makes this thing grow. And two is a completely public portico. That is a social space, which is a feature of almost all of these things. And even in the decade after we've done this research, people keep on building these porticos. They're completely civic things, non-income generating. It's a generosity that is, in a way, out of scale with what you would expect it, but that's indeed what's happening. So this, we did lots of measure drawings. We can go on about it, but can you see there's a soft little red line there that shows the property boundary, because what we did is we studied how do these buildings actually sit on the property boundary, and you can see the vegetable stores there. The plan is quite warren there, and then the upstairs is much more systematic in that it has a central corridor. I'll show you now, and then you can see the portico was built sort of in front of it. This is the inside of it. You can see a central corridor, rooms off the side, shared bathrooms. So although they shared bathrooms, most people wash in rooms, and they maybe use it's basically a shared toilet if you think about it. People cook in their rooms, but people socialize together. They share rides, washing facilities, porticos, those sorts of things. So they are micro social spaces between sort of 6 and 20 houses on a property of 250 square meters. The other crazy thing I did, can only be a nerd like myself, is I studied the conformance of each of the buildings to the building regulation. Because you can, and we do. I mean, we do this in practice. You can do it with an airport, you can do it with a little house like this. But the question was, how legal or illegal is it? And it's interesting, it's largely illegal. And the places where it transgresses in terms of fire regulations. And my speculation is if I had to tell somebody why it does not comply. It's not about the law and the speed limit, that's like, why would you? But I could explain why it could burn down faster and what you could do to fix it. So I could give somebody technical advice as to improving it, and they may very well act on it because it secures their asset. But what you have in this house is not an uncommon thing. It's a timber floor, gum poles with boards on it, and then a thick screed on it. That is a degree of fireproofing. So this could burn maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, fireproofing between these things, and it's interesting. So there are some precast planks that you get, but this is a fairly common system. So when we look at it, we try to learn from it, because the question is not how do we build, the question is how the city built. Because the city is built in majority by citizens for themselves. In other words, if I want to understand building technology, the question is not what do I know as an expert, but what do people know about how to do it. So this is the technical drawings of it. You can see it's a bumper with planks, with boards, and then a screen on top there with walls on top. That is the constructional system. I'm going to show one other one. This is architecturally probably the most accomplished one. Very, very interesting. We had young researchers go in there. We later found out it is a drug factory. Seemed a fairly murderous place, but well, totally. But what happens here is because of the xenophobic attacks in the noon, you find a barricading that takes place that appears understandable to protect the owners and their businesses, but it also protects the drug factory that's inside. But what happens, this one is the clearest architectural one because it's a simple corridor down the middle. And you can see here, you must look at this line because that is within the property, that's outside the property. So what you have is that you have a series of properties that is legal infrastructure that's made, where the first part was built, but behind it was an undefined area of people building shacks. Now, if you can build a shack, why can't you just build a brick house there? So what they did is, again, like the people building the portico in front, they looked at the back and said, what's happening? Nothing. They jumped and they developed the back. And this is the plan of that. So you can see it has a portico in the front already. Central corridor looks like that on the top. And you see where the property line is at the back. So they just built another 8 rooms at the top incrementally, again, expanding the operation. But largely legal. So these rooms are between 6 and 13 square meters. Smallest is 6, biggest is 13. And people make good money and livings out of this. And this is with the backyard shacks, with high street shops, with the flats, with the shalines. This is what it amasses to in a kind of a main road. And the question for us is whether this has a future. Now, we can talk long about this, but when I show the stuff that we're doing at Harvard, we're trying to think dangerous thoughts. We always think, does this have a future or does it lead to catastrophe? So are we landing the plane on its wheels or on the table? Okay, so one is it relies on existing infrastructures, services, but also legal things. The fact that there's a title that somebody can speculate with land that they have some ownership over. It is profitable, and Edgar made a good point in that regard, because somebody's going to make money in order to provide this housing opportunity funds. And it accommodates non-qualifiers. People are born in South Africa, people who make much money, people who are not on the list, on the list, whatever, just wants a house now. You can get access to it. And it would benefit from technical assistance. It's a long story, but I just think that we should have housing assistance or organization assistance, a bit more like healthcare. So if you go to the clinic on a Monday, you tell them what you did over the weekend and you need some medical assistance, they won't reprimand you, they will give you medical assistance. Where the city would tell you, this is the building regulations, you can break it out, blah, 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 blah. And there's no housing assistance. If you say, I'm worried the roof's going to fly off, somebody can't tell you what to do, or will this burn down, or what should I do, So it would benefit by housing assistance and urbanization assistance. Then there's another kind of a pattern, because we're looking at how people could enter this outside of developers, but this is a development that it looks at that question. So this is, I get a house because somebody else could make money off it. It extends it, but this is, instead of citizens building it for themselves, this is a developer building it, making money, and then either renting it out or selling it. But the question for us is, can we use the house as an infrastructure for housing? So in other words, can this physical fabric be an infrastructure for housing opportunity? Now, usually you take the house and the opportunity as equating each other, and it's one house, one housing opportunity. But the question is, can we have one building and a multitude of housing opportunities that's latent? That's important because some of the plans. So this is in Brooklyn, not Brooklyn, United States. This is Brooklyn, And this is again thinking of how people are living in Brooklyn. So the human density at which people are living. So people buy up old suburban houses. They look like suburban house. You just see people coming and going, but the reality is you have family per room. So it replicates the new situation over and over. People make money out of that. That is what people have access to. 6, 13 square meters, a lot of those things, as people get access to the city through it. So the question is, how do you get closer to the city? So you live in a smaller space and you share something. So what it does is, it's a Trojan horse. Make a long story short, it makes row houses. We know row houses. Who will mind if we submit row houses to the city council? It has a facade, it has a front gate. All looks good and well. It has a gap between it. So unlike Victorian row houses, there's a bit of a gap. Cool. Architect designed it. What do we have here? So there are 3 properties, 1 year, and then a split here, so 1, 2, 3 properties. But within the contemporary rights, you can develop 3 houses on a single residential property. So there we are. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's maximum density. But you can probably get about 20 houses there. So how? There's 20 houses here, it's drawn. Can you see it? So this is how it works. It considers this as infrastructure. So let's just go through it slowly. That is just the first floor plan. So what you have in the plan of the house, we just go back one, is that you have the front gate that corresponds with the window of the kitchen. So if you're in the kitchen, you see people at the gate right there. Then there's a little space out there. That's the communal space that replicates the Danoon, the place where you'll have the bride, the place where you have the socialization. And then it's a house with a door there and a door there. You can go straight through. Can you see it? You can go straight through. So what you then have is that you have a unit, so it makes with simple beams and simple construction, so it's not a big span across here, and makes a room there. And then there's a toilet there, but there's a corridor. I mean, so is this a bad architecture? It's a corridor, a small house like this. So let's see what happens upstairs. So what you have is that you have 2 rooms here. There's the corridor, there's a stair, and the bathrooms underneath. Can you see where this is going? So just to analyze it, you can see this is drawing it with furniture. This isn't a way a single family would occupy it, but there's something else in this. There you see the base properties in yellow, and you see the whole inside marked in gray. But I could mark it differently, and I can do this. Say that is the house. This is the residential opportunity. That's the infrastructure. The shared toilet, the basin, and the stairs infrastructure. Because what it does is it opens the front gate to the back garden, which means it makes another space for a house that is there. Or I can have this as a house, and I can have a house upstairs. So that could be one house. and we can add a front door in there. I can go up the stair and I have another front door, and I can go out the backyard and I can have another set of houses. That is the density of Brooklyn. And that is how you can have, I don't know, it's about 20 houses in the space where there should have been 3. But it takes the reality and it tries to reconcile it with economic imperatives that one is making it worthwhile for a developer, but 2 is you think, how could others get access to it? Because housing subsidy for South Africans and it's xenophobia. I remember in 2010, the Zimendaba asked us to design a housing for the SAPs, and we said housing causes xenophobia. It was just before they attacked. I'll never forget how my colleagues laughed at that. Okay, so it thinks of houses as infrastructure for housing and for socialization. It accommodates non-qualifiers again, but it also think of this thing permanent. So that very fancy facade that you see, it's brick, it's permanent, it presents a certain address to the public domain. And in that sense, it gives you a hard carapace in a way that corresponds in a way with the plan of others. It's a long story to talk about, but the sense that you can then have much cruder, less permanent things at the back. It does not matter. It doesn't represent secondary face to the city, where the primary face is then constructed. Okay. The last one I want to show is this idea of, let's say, build with others. And that is a complex argument. It's a long story, but in short, the question is, in the aftermath of land alienation of 110 years ago, a certain entitlement arises that Black South Africans have over land and housing opportunities and the city in general. I'm always amazed that people ask for services. I would just ask for the whole city. Because services is just one part of it. And this is a thing that's saying, well, what would you ask if you ask for the whole city for everything? And to say, well, what you have is you have legal rights, like you change the constitution away, but you have entitlements that arises out of land alienation. Now, what if we had to enhance the state's obligation towards that entitlement? What would it look like? How would it play itself out? So there's a series of studios that I've done where we enact it, where we build the city, where we try and replicate 20 years of urbanization over a period of about 8 hours. We try and see how does it work. And then I do wicked things with the students. I don't always tell them what I plan to do. I set models on fire that replicate very, very real situations here. They sometimes don't talk to me afterwards. Where does it go to? But it makes it patently obvious. So we split in class between citizens and planners, which is a construct that is, I set them up for conflict and see if they fall for it. But the idea is what kind of a city could result out of that. So it's a kind of an exercise. But then the stuff that we did at Harvard, we started looking at the golf courses. We focus on the Indefunu quasi claim that the golf courses in Mowbray Rondebosch should be urbanized. We said, well, how? So part of the terror of that suggestion is just a lack of imagination. We just cannot think how, what would happen. So what we did is we then played this thing out and said, well, if the city is slow and reactive, how would it happen if the citizens had to take professional advice? So this thing of blocking out space for social facilities, for services, for legal rights, etc. How would it work? We can talk about it, but what this does is it thinks that what we need to do as enactments, like pilots do flight simulations, is that if we have to act under huge pressure and with professional skill, you may have to practice a little bit before. Like you want your surgeon to practice before they do it the first time, or you want your pilot not to scream blue murder when the engines go on fire. you want them to be calm, maybe we should practice and do those things as well. So the last one I want to show you is one of those things where we just thought of the pure strategy of how we would settle the golf courses. And it starts like this. You cut down a few trees. You make stakes. You drive them to the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4. You make 6 properties. They're big enough for 12 families. So you give everybody a space and another space. A space for a house and another space. It has a courtyard. That courtyard always faces the water running out. It has a relationship with the road. That space where the water runs out is also the way you're going to get the services in the future. And then we look at how this ages. But the idea is that there's a larger unit that where you could connect it so that we don't land block this thing at the scale of the smallest house in the beginning, but that you have a bigger unit where you can combine 2 or 3 or 4, and it takes Mexican forms of urbanization. And I think it contemplates how this would age over a sort of 100-year period. And it basically comes to models like this that makes these sort of U shapes and C shapes. And then it uses the fairways, and it uses the golf cart routes, because we are saying, well, if you have no money and no infrastructure, what is there? There's irrigation, there's golf cart routes, and if you cut down a few trees and leave the others, you have stakes. You begin to set it up. You can do a block over a weekend, people can settle, you do another block over another weekend. But a professional can tell you about urban fires, stormwater, topography, flood zones, those kinds of things would really help. And then we can go and mass it like that. And in essence, there you can see is the stakes in the ground. You could or could not make yourself some trees there. The first houses could look like that. They could be upgraded over time. They can grow in height and so on. And this is looking at the big golf courses and saying, well, there's the golf carts. What we got to define is, I don't have my glasses on. One is a series of roads that correspond with, they've got to be perpendicular to the dominant wind. They set up fire breaks in essence, and create public safety in that sense, but it's got to be topographical at the same way that they can always carry the water out, because that is sacrosanct, because that's never going to change. And then what you have is a series of these allotments. You can see they bend topographically so that we can always put the water out. And what was this one? Sorry. I can't remember exactly what this was, but you can see that the idea is that a set of rules are set up that you learn, and as you go along, mistakes might be made. And the students that did this with us did this graphic novel, thinking of the parents who had cattle on Rondebosch Common and were making some rules and talking about and invading the golf course with their cows at night. Because it's one thing people settling on a golf course, but what do you do about a cow? Sorry. And then thinking, well, what would it look like if we start building shacks on the golf course and having cows on the fairways and those sorts of things. And then they didn't think about fire, and because we did this via VR during COVID. We were thinking, well, okay, so they made a mistake. They didn't think of fire. And I said to them, well, imagine a place catches on fire and you made a mistake. You have to sit together and think about that and make new rules to have public safety. And then to think, well, how the agriculture lived with this sort of semi-pastoral kind of a world that happens, how we think of flooding and aging and blah, blah, blah. And that is, in essence, the story.
Thanks, Heinrich, and so wonderful, rich set of ideas and provocations. So we hand over to the next presentation, and then we'll have discussion. Thanks, Ingrid.
What's the field you guys speak after such a good conversation like that? Well, Jack, we the schizophrenia that was bagged around, we need things every day, with a sets of ideas in terms of how we see the world. It often doesn't correlate with practice. And opportunities like this is great for us to start reflecting on our own work, where we fucked up, and we make mistakes, where we can improve on our own practice. So thank you to you guys for sharing that experience with us. There are two examples of our work that I want to share with you. They're both in progress, and they, in retrospect, try and talk to this issue that I think is dear to our heart as well. To that we can't rely on government, as Peter says, to solve the housing problem, and I think that is mainly clear. And secondly, despite the work of Mfuno Kwazi in promoting inclusion housing practices, very, very little has been delivered, if anything at all. So as been explained by both the previous speakers, there are other ways that things are happening. People are improvising in how they do things. So two examples that I will share with you. The one talks about city catching up. How does the city now respond to this? And I think there's some innovative work that's been done, and we're fortunate to be party to some of that work. And Lena, Stan, and Sahra, they're the back there. They're the ones who do hard work. And the second example is Anipa, which is a very interesting example as well. Anipa is a small town in Namibia, and their lesson for us certainly is about the issue of land and how to get land to the people who need it. So, and of course, we'll overlay with some of our work onto the issues as well. So first of all, Anipa. Those are the companies we're working with. Akra Landscape Architect, Isidima, I think you guys know from Durban, Marisburg rather, and Max Fordham. And the question, of course, is about access to land. Where the lessons to learn from it for us. So Anipa is in the very far north of Namibia. It is located in a spectacular landscape. So you can imagine this landscape stretching for hundreds of kilometers from the mountains in Angola all the way through to Tashapan. So the landscape is flat as a pancake. And the consequence, finally, of the flat landscape is where does water go? Of course, it ends up in a Tashapan in the middle of a desert. But it traverses this landscape, which is water everywhere. In fact, it is not rivers, it is called oshanas, a local term. So the ponding of water everywhere. And the pattern of settlement you can see, right? And you can see the scale of this landscape is epic. The pattern of settlement is effectively where people build and how they occupy the land. In this instance, you have a small household, and they tend to, as the family grow, they grow another room. But what surrounds that is a wall or fence that keeps the animals out. And then there's a logic for farming where you can't farm. And then there's space for the water or the ecology of the place. And this happens at an enormous scale without one urban designer or town planner. So there's an inherent knowledge of the place and the land and how to work with it that doesn't need us. But also it means that from a planning point of view, that there's no place to build. But what that means in practice is the landscape, traditional ways of occupying the land, is in a kraal type of thing, so the Okavango and how they organize their cultural practices and how they live is then translated to more contemporary forms. And when it comes to the urban context, all of those lessons are lost. And we revert back to the modernist, deterministic way in which planning happens. And of course, that's the gap for me, for us. Right? So we're working with an NGO called the Development Workshop. They originated in Angola, in fact. I've done most of the work in Namibia. And we are connected to the workshop through another NGO based in Switzerland called the Integrated Sustainable Development Foundation. And all they do is get money and they pull us along and they try and help other NGOs improve the quality of what they deliver. But the really powerful thing that we do, and I guess the gist of this example, is the ability to work with local authorities to deliver land. And they do it remarkably fast. They negotiate with the municipality for a piece of land, any piece of land that's available that isn't distant from the urban centers, and they get the municipality to provide the land for free. The land is unserviced, right? So there's no costs associated to delivering the land for the municipality other than passing off a piece of land. And we've got plenty of examples of this locally. We can go through all the examples of the city putting out parcels of the land or politicians putting out parcels of land and it not materializing. There's a land preparation process, and they, got a step-by-step laid out what needs to be done. And this is where we've been participating in trying to adjust what they do here. And what we do very, very well is identify who the beneficiaries are, facilitate the financing through it can be a South African bank. In developing a finance scheme, and also in facilitate the land to the beneficiary. And that process happens very quickly. So the land preparation tends to happen in parallel with the beneficiary selection and the financing model. So all they do is they work with the municipality and say, who's on your waiting list? Or if you can prove that you don't have access to land or you earn below a certain amount, you can then apply directly to them. But effectively, they work with municipalities' database to identify who is on the waiting list. They approach them and say, would you like to invest? And the beneficiary decides whether they want to invest or not. They then help the beneficiary to get access to financing through a revolving fund, to each beneficiary contributing the value of the cost of the land. And remember, in this case, it's not the land, but the cost of servicing the land that they pay for. And they're given 2 years to pay it up. So within 24 months, somebody has access to land. And then they have another 24 months within which to build their own house. Often that is done, informally, initially, but over a period of time, they are required to do something that is formal on the land. But within 4 years, you can own your own piece of land without any government assistance, other than, of course, in the land. Okay, so I will make a little bit of what we have done in this as well. There's some other lessons that we could bring to the development workshop in return. Because what we're doing in terms of the design solutions was still the modernist zoning plan of cutting up land, rezoning it for single residential, and following through that the process that we know all too well in South Africa. We said two things. Right? The first is we have to protect the water. You can't simply lay your grid over the path all down. Exactly the same. You got to accommodate the heave and flow of water. And in this instance, there's all sorts of cultural practice that goes alongside water, like the cows. Same cows, huh? Same cows, but also some agricultural functions and the like. One, protect the water first task. Second task is that the one very powerful symbol in a flat landscape was the trees. And those trees in a hot, humid environment is where people meet. It's simply both in terms of doing trade, as well as just relaxing, getting out of the sun, socializing and talking. So the trees in this landscape are mature and they're everywhere. They're everywhere. So, but they weren't considered to be valuable enough to organize around, other than, let's say, old agricultural practices, everyday practices. Our proposition to them was that this is your public space, and that you need to build around the value of what that tree offers. And we say very simply, if you organize your plots, don't organize on a suburban grid, organize around a tree. So tree is your public space. First move, and that can be rolled out under Charles Career in his fragmentation. What's it? Fractals as his method of using the same typology and how to organize the site produces complex public spaces as well. And that system was an overlay, but very, very simple. We know this as the practitioners of using a grid, a very simple grid that orders the size of land that you able to afford and the typologies of houses that can fit onto it. And that system is then organized. In fact, Lena was very studious in determining what is an optimal grid. Starting from the size of a room, in other words, the room is about the ergonomics of somebody in a room, and then multiplying that, across the scale of a house, how you organize a house. But then the sites on the same grid is in organizing a community. And the reason why the grid is so useful in this context is it provides a framework within which people can act independently, but that collectively it will hopefully give a collective impression of what the community is, the values, etc. So we played that out, and I'm not going to go into too much detail. 6 minutes, okay, I'm rushed to it, right? That plays out, and importantly, what we've done was we married the sequencing of spaces with the cultural practices. Boys' rooms, girls' rooms, the sequencing of arrival and hosting friends. And that got translated, and I'm going to skip through all of this. That was a set of practices that drives how community can self-organize over time. Okay, but the lesson here obviously is the lesson on land in particular, and giving people access to land so that they can act. The second example is a local example, and some of you may be also be aware of this, and it takes lessons from the work that Heinrich and the like has done. There are many other NGOs that's operating in this work. Lisa, which is DAG, and DAG has been doing lots of work with micro developers. The people that Heinrich had referred to earlier, the guys who are building or using the home that they own and using it as a business opportunity to provide rental opportunity for others. So with I don't know if the city officials are here, Anise and Bronwyn and Lisa. There we go. We have some city officials here at my time, and they know all answers. I'll tell you my perspective of opportunity. Is that the delivery of these houses are happening despite the city's rules and regulations, and there's a demand that is understood. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because Edgar mentioned, what it means for Western Cape. But similarly, there are ways of practice that is not foreign to you and I. My mother's house has got a granny flat at the back to kind of rent, but this happens at scale. It's not only the delivery of, let's say, 3,600 units that Conradi has delivered, and we're expecting that it will take 10 to 15 years to deliver that number of houses. This happens at scale without any subsidies. And everywhere, from Athlone to Delft to maybe not some of the leafy suburbs, but throughout our city. And I won't belabor what Heinrich has already kind of described and what people are already doing on the sites. The big limitation from the city's perspective is issues of compliance. How do, and the question the cities will ask themselves is how does the city not only act as a big brother, issuing fines and whipping people, but rather see the opportunity to, and there are plenty of rules, right? Rules from town to, there's just rules. National building regulations, zoning rules, it is just endless rules that is completely inaccessible to the layman. So compliance being the opportunity is to how to assist micro developers in becoming compliant. So that's our brief. Our brief is to take some designs the city had produced and to make essentially council submission drawings for those typologies that have already been pre-approved. Well, not pre-approved, but there is at least a pre-scrutiny process that the city said, we are happy with this. If you need to adjust, you obviously look again, but effectively, we didn't have to provide them with a model, a live model. In this case, it's a Revit-based model to anybody wants it for free. Okay, and that means that anybody can take a pre-approved plan, adapt it for their context, and then should be able to fly through an approval process. When this process started, of course, is with DAG and the likes of DAG in the engagements with micro developers and working with them closely to understand what they need, what is practically possible and what's not, in terms of what they do. The first thing, and we had big debates with the city and our team, is when are we going to deliver? When we differentiate the delivery of the old 51/2 type housing that was built in the party era, and will we have the risk of having the same reputation of building housing that is undignified? So the very first decision we said was, what is the minimum dignified space for people to live in? And that implied going back to, Architecture 101, ergonomics. How big are things and when can we recommend some of those ergonomic constraints to be compromised and when not? And in fact, it's very, very little opportunity for what we call less than what we have. So to translate what the developers have built as the minimum to something that is dignified. Then in that module, what are the fixes? So in this case, it was the wet cores and predominantly the wet cores that are fixes. There are two typologies in this example. The wet cores are the fixes, but the way to expand the model has been described, the way to do it, and again, based on the modular system, in this case, derived from the size of a concrete block. And we, as the consultant team, have developed a set of drawings that's compliant. Right? It's been checked by the city, we checked it with the engineers and other consultants, but particularly things on fire, how to manage fire, ventilation, servicing, and how one kind of builds the kit of parts to go up, for example, what the implications going up. Fire is a big thing, as we all know. And the city is very, very uncompromising when it comes to fire. And as soon as we went up, city insisted that we have fire rails. And in this kind of context, is it realistic to imagine that there will be fire rails? So what are the alternatives for those kind of things? And we produced, Lena has produced, you produced a set of approved building plans that will be given for free. Anybody who wants it, you have a free set of Revit plans that you then can adapt to your context, to your site. Okay. In this way, helping the micro developers circumvent the delays in, or encourage them to actually become compliant. Hopefully that works. We'll see. Where there's the bigger opportunity, and we're starting to have this conversation in the city, is that once you've got a Revit model, it's an electronic thing. You can push and pull, and it's effectively open source in a sense. In fact, our client gave us instructions to remove Jakupa from the families, the name Jakupa in families, because it now belongs to the world, right? Everybody has access to your families in the Revit. And there's some, and there's it's also time out. Okay. So we got all this information in GIS data layers, whether the lane can get access to it, and whether you can take our model on your cell phone, apply it to your site in GIS, and then get your plan approved of your cell phone. And that conversation is in process. We're not quite there. So very quickly, Edgar, we've got some lessons that I want to just for ourselves mostly. Is that land is the issue. First of all, land, giving access to land that is affordable and not for free is our first proposition. The second is that time is our partner. And the same issues that Heinrich in particular has raised is that incrementalism and small scale and many iterations by many different people offers huge opportunities for us to look at housing differently and deliver housing differently. Technology is also our partner. And finally, that us as architects and urbanists need to rethink our role in this process, as opposed to only being extraction of fees, but that possibly not only the person to all the plans and the designs, but we also facilitate. And this is not new, bottom-up plan is not new, except that we insist that we have a role to play in the bottom-up and that we bring our expertise more than just being facilitators of a process. We are active participants in making solutions. Okay, and then we must take out. I understand that. Okay, on that note, thank you.
Thanks so much. So we can just dive straight into, there was two fantastically rich presentations and some great topics that's going. So the floor is open. Please introduce yourself very briefly. And there's some interior decoration. So can I get a show of hands who wants to go? While the chairs are being. I've got one hand. I'll take, then we'll do number two. Anyone else from the back? Okay. Do we have a microphone or how do we do?
We have another one somewhere. Yeah, there's another one. I should turn it on.
Yeah, so for those at the back who may ask questions, just move to the front, please, so we can. Okay.
There we go.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring. Thank you so much. All the way from Bloemfontein, Jan Simon, the Free State Institute of Architect region, SIA, the architect developer. We started a process of human settlements within one municipality. We just had the recent land grab in a suburb called the Reed Park. Looking at these opportunities is understanding the figures. 3.7 million homes needed today. If you want to forecast the delivery of that over the next 8 years, can we solve the problem? And I think that is the debate. And how soon can we solve it? So coming back to deliverables, and the focus on government is in itself the issue. To privatize the whole process, I think that's critical. But the question here is, can we deliver at scale, say 700,000 homes annually?
I'm Al Stratford. I come from the end of the Cape Colony in the beginning of Africa, which is East London. Yeah. And one of the things that I'd like to raise is this whole thing of dignity. In 1979, I was in Lazi, was the first self-help housing little centre there. And with Peter Malafani, who was the first black architect qualified in South Africa. And we did a windscreen survey. How did people upgrade their 51/9 house? Essentially what they did was build a new house around it, face brick, new image, new dignity, and take the old house out through the front door and sell it. That was just what is happening there. Then I worked with CEDA, Swedish International Development Aid, in Duncan Village in East London. And the Swedes won the competition, international competition. And they designed houses which had lovely little foyer, where you hang your boots and your coats in winter, which we don't have here like that. Okay. And at the end of the day, the problem was, how do we get the municipality to manage what was happening, this whole backyard thing? So we actually looked at it from the wrong end, because it's not going to be managed, never will be. So the approach that has been taken here, to me, is the way forward. To actually get involved with the community and see how it actually happens on the ground, and let it be in a construct that one can actually work with. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think historical perspectives in this discussion is so important. Some of that will say excellent. Any other comments we've got about? We're going to go a little bit over time, guys, if that's okay. So we've got about 10, 20, 15 minutes, but yeah, just want to see at the back. Thanks. Do you mind coming to the front, please? Just because we have a shot for the lead can go. Thanks.
See the run.
I don't know. It's a very controversial kind of thing that I'm just feeling, and Edgar, I was trying to say I've always been such a huge fan of your work and followed you for years. So it's with deep respect that I say this. That I don't know about this the schizophrenia and the bipolar. I think those are genetic conditions, and otherwise they crop up when you have PTSD or trauma. And those things, you can often say apartheid is part of that trauma and part of our growth or unpacking that we have to do. But I do think there is also this corruption, and I think to call it a disorder that gets medicated is to romanticize poverty and the lack of ethics and integrity. And in fact, I think we need to become active and proactive resistors, and have active resistance, which we need in our culture, not only in the third world, but in the first world too. And part of that is that it throws us back into the questions of our own creativity to deal with this trauma, and how we have to re-envision. And we are the architects, we are the people that can provide these building blocks for vision and creativity. And how can we look within those words of facilitation? And I think the letting go, realizing that people are doing it for themselves. Those are the people actually that are the most traumatized, that need the most facilitation, they don't often have the gift of creative, they don't have the resources. They have the resources of creativity within within scarcity, but also they need that vision that only the third eye perspective can create. So I think I suppose the question would be back to, how do we take a vision while at the same time holding on to that vision, and maybe in that binary sort of way, where one is the visionary, but also knowing where to let go, and also the facilitator, and working from the ground up in this way that also the time unpacks, and to work with time as both like kind of linearly and circularly. So yeah, I think we have to re-question our role in this thing, which is what you alluded to, all of you, but just how to maybe string it up and refine that within our gift of architecture and being able to see outside of scale, and how do we sew these things so we've got a medical toolkit that can start to facilitate, that we can reflect and create. What would that toolkit be?
Thank you. Yeah. Please. We'll just collect as many and then we can have around.
Hi, apologies for the question.
I had to think about
Introduction.
Hi, Sakla. We spoke a bit about the problematics of policy, but as practitioners, we tend to have to, in terms of reality, work within the system. How do we subvert it? How do we push against that system in order to make change? I think just thinking about how we can mention the problematics, but in order to install change, we have to work within that system. So how do we do that?
Great, thank you. Super focused. Okay, yeah, please.
Hi everyone, my name is Sia, I'm from Zutari. I'm speaking about the massive backlog of housing. I think the policy in South Africa really states that you're entitled to a house. So the shift of you shifting people to become backlog dwellers in South Africa or for South African is a bit far-fetched in today's circumstances. I think one thing I feel like we're still lacking is who are the people that are the macro or micro developers, which are largely foreign nationals that then also allow for foreign nationals to stay in those backlog developments. And my question is, what solution do we then have to encourage the cultural or the mindset as Black South Africans that since 1994 we were promised a house and therefore we shall wait for a house? So yeah.
Thanks. So before I ask our two speakers to share reflections, just to kind of drive home the point a little bit about context. So as an upper middle income country, we are completely an outlier with an unemployment rate close to 40%, and the young people between 16 and 25, 65%. There's no prospect in the short to medium term that is going to reverse. We'll never get to a growth rate of about 5, 6, 7% anytime soon. And then there's a whole bunch of very complicated reasons why our economy is structurally in that crisis. So the fact of structural unemployment, which is associated with poverty because we are an income-driven society and economy, and connected with profound and deep wealth inequality. 10% of South Africa's population owns 90% of South Africa's wealth. In those structural contexts, there is zero prospect that we can imagine a working class social mobility trajectory where people get a job that is not well paid, but their kids go to school, they graduate, etc. That's not on the cards for us. So the urbanization of poverty is our reality, meaning livelihoods will stem from the informal, illicit, and criminal economies. It's a fact of life. And that goes with a whole number of social cultural challenges in terms of trauma, violence, various kinds of pathologies. So I just want to kind of inject a bit of realism into the conversation, because this is not about romanticizing anything. This is about saying, let's be humble enough to pay attention to what people are doing when the state is incapable of delivering at the scale that it's promised, the house for all. People know that, right? And in any case, the minister has not said how many times you can't be old to get a house, you can't be young to get a house, you've got to be, well, you know, like that policy has been kind of from the hip been adapted. So people know that the game is up. It's not going to happen. Like they do know. I know we have this idea that everyone's waiting. It's not true. It's a myth. People are hustling. So, so just as a context, right? So let's not, you know, that is our reality for at least the next decade. Ain't going to change anytime soon, because our economy is completely open to the global economy. We are completely vulnerable to our positioning in that global economy. So we have very few levers at that macro level of the economy. So there's no good jobs coming anytime soon. Maybe at the edges, if there's good policy, good governance. But, you know, with the first generation of a coalition government at the national level, within the next 5 years, limited prospect, because we're going to have to learn our way through what it means to live a society as a set of agreements. We don't yet know how, we don't have a culture for that. So let's just kind of recalibrate ourselves. Like, it's a tough environment. And so when we talk about learning from practice and thinking through how to codify that in a language that the state can process, which is the work you're doing, and thinking in ways that communities can be organize themselves more effectively in collectives to be able to accumulate capital and invest that capital in a strategic way around some of the typologies that Heinrich was mentioning. Like, what does that mean for us, right? That's the debate. That's the conversation. So do you want to respond to some of the comments?
I'll start with the first. There's a couple of things that maybe that I can contribute to Pushit. The very first thing that I think I want to clarify is that this book, the Urban Designers Amongst Us, the book by Kevin Lynch called The Image of the City. And the image of the city is, as we know, largely a Western European image of what a city needs to be. And, through the legacy of our history, apartheid planning, and that image of what we think our city needs to be is unfortunately distorted from the reality. So the very, very first provocation that I want to put you is to change what you think the beautiful city is. Because it doesn't, that beautiful city, that modernist city, is largely a derivative of, shall we say, science. It's lost its humanity. That we will find ourselves in through collective action. And the collective is not you as the architect. The collective is the people, the everyday people making those changes in their own houses that will become our image of who we are. If what we build is a reflection of our values, look at what is being built. Your image of Kevin Lynch is misguided. So who we are collectively is well beyond the CBD. Look at what we've done in Delft, for example. There's some very, very real things that's happening out there. The second thing that I just want to reflect on also is looking at what our role in this is and what opportunities there are in practice that we can perhaps engage with. Some ideas, some architectural ideas and urban design ideas that is real for us, where we can intervene in this kind of context. And Jakupa in particular, we've been experimenting with ideas of strategic structure planning, which means that in a state that is unable to deliver, what are the most important things that they must deliver? What are the fixes in that plan that is the first actions that we can control of? And what are the actions that will allow other people to deliver themselves? And I want to reflect on one project in particular, is Spine Road. We were asked to do an NMT facility. The city's mind at the time were pointed us, NMT, in fact, he was here, it was his project as well. The mind of the city, it is building a bicycle path in Kailicha where nobody cycled. Okay. So the opportunity in the money that was set aside for the task, we used to do much more than provide a bicycle facility. We did two things where we made infrastructure. We made it to more than just accommodate bicycles. So corners became places for containers to find a home. The bus stop, we put some cheese and a bench in addition to this. The second thing that we did was we became activists. We whispered in people's ears and said, guys, in Spine Road, turn your backs into fronts. That's all we did. We set up the opportunity and use subversive action, subversive action to counter what the zoning laws allowed him to do and what not allowed to do. And if you go to Spine Road on a Friday afternoon, Friday evening today, it is one of the most vibrant places you'll find, not because of our action, but because of the neighbors acting collectively based on a strategic structure plan. It's a very practical thing that we can do to facilitate development. And we can imagine that Spine is going to be a high street in the future once things formalize. That container becomes a formal shop. Last thing, maybe before I hand over to Heinrich. There is a different role, I think, we play, and technology in particular. Because we are fortunately custodians of technology. And a very practical example, also, Gabs can perhaps reflect on this better, is that we use Revit, and we had a conversation earlier with Heidi, I think it was, about the cost of Revit. And we produced a plan for the micro units using a very expensive piece of software. Expensive software. Whether those tools are appropriate, I was hoping that you know me on that. But nonetheless, we acknowledge that there's a problem. There's also an opportunity in thinking through the use of technology, that everybody's access to smartphones and the opportunity in that. And the city is also considering whether they don't buy the license, that we can use that. But interesting enough, that Revit wasn't the tool we used to communicate with in the public meetings. It was gewone cardboard models.
Yeah.
Three-dimensional things people could touch, pull apart, and reconnect to reshape. So again, there's multiple tools perhaps that we should rethink as to how we can use our inherent knowledge in a different kind of context. And if I'm sure you've got better thoughts.
I will leave it to you.
What is interesting is the reaction to the psychological and the terminology that you quote. And I do think it's worth just thinking about that for a moment. People asking about delivery at scale, this expectation of answers and rights, those kinds of things. It's a bit like, my one son surfed the internet and one day came and said, "Dad, when are you getting a six-pack?" And it's like, if you are we going to deliver so many hundred thousands of units? It's like, it's about the same answer. It's impossible, isn't it? There's something wrong with the question. We know. I cannot know why he's asking. I can't say he's wrong for asking.
My son just says, I know you're never going to get one. Don't even pretend.
We suffer from hoping. So this now comes to the situation is that can you count the backlog? I'm a bit perplexed by this question. It's like so many, it's like when people say a number, I switch off. I can't remember the numbers ever because I think it's impossible. It's like, when am I going to give it to like? It's like, it's impossible question. That is the problem. And the relevance of interrogating the psychological terminology is that we know about the trauma. We know that there was a certain expectation created by the promise of a subsidized house that we cannot fulfill, we're falling short of it. And there's this thing of reconciling our expectations with our reality. And that is difficult because it's entangled in heavy grade politics and it's sort of things that you can't admit to. It's like saying, I would like to have been beautiful, but I'm not. I would like to be rich, but I'm not. I would like my children to behave, but they don't. But we are incredibly happy. There are such wonderful things happening. And it's not to take away from the disaster of urban fire, grinding poverty, real violence, and so on. But there's something about saying, if we ever articulate what is wrong and too few of, and so on, we have an institutionalized pessimism and we are grinding ourselves down to dust. So we have to separate. In a way, like you're saying, well, what can we do? What can't we do? We very much think in those terms. I support what you said very much. What can the city realistically do? What must they do constitutionally? I think the fire chief has a constitutional duty that he or she is in default of. We can talk about that. But there's something about saying, well, is this general groundswell of people providing houses for themselves not what is happening? And that is the numbers that we should be counting. And not, we can't count against the backlog of subsidized housing problems. It's never going to happen. It's like, when are we going to give this answers? Never. It's like, when are we going to build houses? Never. We know that's the answer. But how do you share it? The thing is to say, well, let's count this in a different way. It's like, what is the number of housing that's being provided by citizens for themselves? What's this multiplication? So if there's so many 100,000 missing, are those families out in the street? The reality is they are not. They are inside buildings. So, what are we talking about? So there's indeed a kind of a vast mismatch between our language and our reality. So there are buildings that people are in. People might not have the kind of rights we want, they might not have to enjoy the kind of safety that we want. But there's a thing that Urban Landmark wrote some time ago about the incremental advancement of rights, which I think is such a fundamental statement about reaching constitutional imperatives, getting to better cities and so on. It's saying, well, it doesn't happen the first day. I mean, I still think parts of Venice is it's a real stinking dump. Whenever my kids go there, they say, "What? How is that city? It smells like the sewers." I say, that's Venice. So the thing is, there we are gonna advance it over time, but we have to adjust our age to what is possible, and we cannot linger in a state of unhappiness. It's just not psychologically healthy because we other those who should be providing the housing. And that is getting us into a psychological bind where we think there's something wrong with somebody who should do the house for us. In a way, like you were saying, it's your opening thing where you're saying it's all of us, it's all of our failure. It's a failure of imagination, it's a failure of the language and terminology. We've got to get that right in a way to begin to feel that we are making better lives for people.
Thanks, Andy. So just on that note, and to reinforce it, and then I'll hand over to the person who will do the votes of thanks. So just to flex a little bit more. So when I was at the opening of the academic year in Madrid, Alejandro Arvena was there, as you know, won the Pritzker Prize a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever. And what is interesting when you speak to Alejandro is the Chilean architect, who's literally taken exactly what the two of you were talking about and has tried to figure out what does a practice look like that does exactly the work that you're talking about. And for me, that seems to be the cutting edge of our field. Come to your really important question about how does one, what does it mean to be subversive? So I think that there's a whole plethora of fascinating innovations happening at the scale of rethinking code, regulatory code, through to building materials, to urban design principles that doesn't arrive from the Lynch imaginary to whatever. And what is amazing is that no one has all the answers, but there's something about learning how to move between the experiments that is testing these things and building new tribes where we are with other people who are moving between these things, both in terms of thought, because I think there is also an important revolution in urban theory building and spatial theory imagination, but most importantly in terms of testing alternatives within the constraints and figuring out what it means to work in the spirit of this. And that's really the thing, because also you get a deep, profound professional satisfaction and pleasure from knowing you're part of a larger community that is searching, that is learning, that's testing, that is inherently modest, what we know and what we can do as professionals. And so it's a disposition. It's not a specific set of things, it's about how we move in the world and in the city. So yeah, so I think these two are exemplars of that disposition. And thank you everyone for being here and for the engaged questions. And I want to hand over to the Jakupa colleague who will do a final vote of thanks. And there are more, they're going to apply you with some food and more drinks. And so please don't leave. Spend time. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Okay, thank you to everybody who came out today. I think this is a very important topic for all of us. We just want to say thank you firstly to our co-hosts, Sifa and Michael, for making this possible. And just a reminder, this is a
CPD event. So if you do need to register, that is available in the forecourt. Secondly, to our sponsors, AirTech, PyTech, Baltic, specifically AirTech, who did the wonderful stage that I'm standing on and the seating that you're sitting on. It's a lightweight concrete block. You can check it out on the website. And then to our speakers, obviously, the main characters of this event, Edgar Peterson, Helen Paul, Friday Peter. Thank you so much. Just a little bit of thank you from us. Just to say,
Oh, thank you.
okay.
Thank you very much.
Just a little something. And for Carly Davis.
Family dog.
Thank you very much for being here. To the Jakupa team again for putting this together. There is food and drinks in the full court. The idea is that you network with people that you don't know. So yeah, do that and enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Cool.